time, as we know it, may be an illusion. Motion, nothing more than a fleeting trick of our perception. In the universe, a battleground between the forces of love and strife. What if reality is not changing constantly as we perceive it to be, but is instead all encapsulated in the eternal present? These are the ideas that we'll explore today as we talk about three excellent pre-Socratic philosophers: Parmenides, Zeno of Elea, and Empedocles, whose bold thinking challenged the very foundations of how we see the world and our place within it. So join me as we dive into our fourth episode of the history of philosophy. Let's begin with Parmenides, born around 515 BC into a wealthy family. Though he was a student of Xenophanes, who we discussed in our last video, which I'll link below, Parmenides departed drastically from his teacher's ideas. Some historians speculate that he had deep ties to the Pythagoreans, yet Parmenides would go on to create such a unique philosophy that it would challenge every single Greek philosopher that came after him. In a famous poem written in Homeric hexameters, Parmenides tells the story of a man who is swept up in a chariot to meet a goddess, perhaps representing wisdom itself, who tells him the truth of reality. His arguments are made through her lips, and what shocking arguments they were. According to Parmenides, our senses, which we rely on to interact with the world every single day, are nothing but deceiving. True knowledge, he claimed, can only be achieved through logic and reason, not through perception. A striking claim in an age where they were trying to move away from myth and towards observation as a means of understanding reality. The goddess explains that only what is can be spoken or thought about, while what is not only non-existent, but unspeakable and impossible to think about. In other words, if you can think of something, it must exist in some form. There is no room for non-existence in Parmenides' view of reality. This leads to a profound conclusion. Reality, or what is, or being itself, must be infinite, indivisible, and unchangeable. There can be no change, no motion, and no such thing as time. To Parmenides, everything that has ever existed and will ever exist exists right now in the eternal present. Any idea of something coming into being and then passing away is merely an illusion of human perception. Compared to the ideas of earlier thinkers like Anaximenes, who proposed that the arche, the fundamental principle of the universe, changed depending on density, Parmenides' philosophy was radical. He rejected the idea that the universe was in any state of change or flux, because in order for that to be true, that means that there must have been a time when what is not became what is, and what is becomes what is not. Something that was non-being coming into being. This idea that reality was one and unchanging sparked extreme controversy in his time, and it was an argument that every philosopher after him would have to debunk before they could propose their idea. One of his most influential followers, Zeno, would take up this challenge and defend Parmenides' ideas with the use of paradoxical arguments. Zeno, born around 490 BC, was not just Parmenides' student, but his adopted son, and by some accounts, even his lover. I'm not even going to try to unravel that one. Just like his teacher though, Zeno was a man of daring intellect and courage. Aristotle credits him with inventing the method of dialectic, a form of argument aimed at discovering truth through discourse, rather than simply scoring points in a debate. Zeno's brilliance lay in his ability to take his opponent's argument and turn it against themselves, showing them the logical fallacies that it contained. This method, known as reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to the absurd, became a powerful tool in philosophical debate. Zeno's paradoxes aimed at defending Parmenides' views that reality was one are some of the most famous in philosophical history. One such paradox is the arrow in flight. Zeno argued that at any given instant in flight, the arrow occupies a space equal to its length and is therefore motionless. While this may sound counterintuitive, Zeno's point was to show that our understanding of motion was inherently flawed. If reality is unchanging, as his teacher surmised, then movement itself is impossible and merely an illusion of the senses. Many of Zeno's arguments seem to directly target the Pythagoreans, who held that reality is composed of discrete units. Zeno attacked this belief in plurality with another paradox. If things are made of many parts, there must be something else between those parts, and something else between those parts, which leads to an infinite regress. If reality were truly plural, it would be finite, because you could count the parts. But it would also have to be infinite because you should be able to divide those parts continuously, a contradiction within the very argument for plurality that the Pythagoreans had made. His paradoxes would go on to provoke generations of thinkers, even inspiring mathematical developments in the field of calculus centuries later. However, Zeno was not just a philosopher, he was a man of action and principle. Legend has it that he died trying to overthrow a tyrant. When captured, Zeno reportedly bit the tyrant's ear and refused to let go until he was stabbed to death. His fearless defiance in both life and thought left a legacy that would not only inspire philosophers, but revolutionaries. Revolutionaries who did eventually overthrow the tyrant. Finally, we turn to Empedocles, a philosopher, a poet, and a self-proclaimed god who was born into an aristocratic family in Sicily. While he was known for his arrogance, he was also a man of great ideas. He believed that the universe was governed by 4 eternal and indestructible elements: fire, earth, air, and water, which he called roots, as opposed to arche. Unlike Parmenides, who argued that all of reality is one, Empedocles introduced a pluralistic cosmology in which everything was made up of some combination of these 4 elements. Elements that were constantly shifting under the motive forces of 2 things: love and strife. Love, he thought, was the motive force that seemed to bind everything together, and strife was the destructive force that seemed to rip everything apart. The cosmos, according to Empedocles, was in a cycle of creation and destruction as these 2 forces waxed and waned. While the vision of a cosmos governed by love and strife might seem fantastical, Empedocles was basing that on real-world observations. Primarily, he saw these forces at work within human relationships, where of course love brings people together and strife tears them apart. Empedocles also had some ideas that sound incredibly modern. He believed that creatures arose from random combinations of the 4 elements, and that only the ones that were well suited to survive did so, a concept that foreshadows Darwin's theory of natural selection by millennia. Though Empedocles held Parmenides' belief that the senses were deceptive, he made significant strides towards the scientific inquiry as we know it today. In fact, he's credited with performing the first scientific experiment ever in history. Using a water clock, he demonstrated that air was a substance and not some empty void as most people believed at the time, by driving his thumb down into the water clock and releasing it to let the air bubbles escape. This was observational proof to him that air couldn't just be some empty void, but must be a physical substance. His blend of mysticism, of poetry, and of philosophy makes Empedocles one of the most fascinating early Greek philosophers. As we've seen with everyone we've studied so far, Parmenides, Zeno, and Empedocles each left their mark on early philosophy. Parmenides' claim that reality is one and unchangeable sparked a revolution in metaphysics. Zeno's paradoxes forced philosophers to confront the limitations of their perceptual capacities. And Empedocles' vision of a universe governed by elemental forces of both love and strife introduced a dynamic cosmology that still resonates today. These philosophers remind us that questioning the nature of reality isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a bold act of imagination and courage. So what do you think? Are our senses deceiving us? Is there an objective reality beyond what we can perceive? And is reality shaped by forces that constantly cycle, creating moments of destruction and also moments of rebirth? Tell me your thoughts below. And thank you for watching another episode of the History of Philosophy. I hope that you'll subscribe and join me as we finish up our time with the Presocratics before moving on to the man himself, Socrates. Have a great week.